There's a Canadian province named after a sound. Not a person, not a battle, not a king. A sound. The sound of water dragging across rock that the Cree people heard and decided could only be one thing, a spirit scratching with its hands. That province is Manitoba, and the story behind that name is stranger and more beautiful than any map will ever tell you. To understand where Manitoba comes from, you have to understand the world the Cree people lived in around and before European contact. The Cree were, and remain, one of the largest indigenous groups in North America, with communities stretching from present-day Quebec all the way to Alberta. Their territory was not just land, it was a living system of relationships between people, animals, water, and forces that did not always have visible forms. Central to Cree spiritual life was the concept of Manitou, sometimes written Manitou or Manitou depending on the dialect. This was not a simple word. It described a quality of sacred power, the animating force behind things that were extraordinary, mysterious, or beyond ordinary human explanation. A Manitou was not necessarily a god in the Western sense. It was closer to a presence, a will embedded in the natural world. Lake Manitoba sits in the heart of what is now the province of the same name. It is a long, shallow lake, and under the right wind conditions, its waves hit the narrow limestone passages along its northern shore and produce an eerie, rhythmic sound. Not a crash, more of a grinding, a scraping. The kind of sound that, in the right context, sounds unmistakably like something enormous moving its hands across stone. Origin story: 3 men. And the earliest recorded form of the name Manitoba in written documentation dates to 2026 in terms of formal etymological cataloging, but the oral and geographic history behind it reaches back centuries earlier into Cree usage of the landscape. The name comes from the Cree phrase that translates most accurately as the strait where the spirit scratches, or, more literally, the place where Manitou scratches with hands. The key geographic feature here is the Narrows, a pinch point along Lake Manitoba where the lake's waters are forced through a relatively tight channel. When wind pushes water through that channel and across the flat, ridged limestone at the shoreline, the acoustic result is remarkable. Witnesses over the centuries have described it as a low, sustained scraping, almost rhythmic, almost intentional. For the Cree communities living near this lake, that sound was not a geological curiosity. It was a communication, evidence of a Manitou at work. Now, this is where the documented history becomes genuinely interesting. When French and British explorers and fur traders began mapping the interior of the continent in the late 1600s and 1700s, they frequently adopted indigenous place names, sometimes accurately, sometimes through layers of mishearing and translation. One of the critical figures in the early European documentation of this region was the French explorer and trader Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, the Sieur de la Vérendrye, who pushed into the Manitoba Basin in the 1730s and 1740s. La Vérendrye's journals reference the lake and the surrounding territory using names clearly drawn from Cree and Assiniboine sources. His accounts, written between roughly 1731 and 1749, represent some of the earliest French cartographic engagement with the landscape that would become the province. A few decades later, in the era of the Hudson's Bay Company's expanding influence, company surveyor and explorer David Thompson, working in the late 1700s and early 1800s, produced detailed maps of the region that further codified the name. Thompson, who lived among indigenous communities for significant periods and learned multiple indigenous languages, would have understood that the name carried descriptive meaning. He was not simply copying a sound. He was, in a sense, translating an experience. The transition from Cree oral geography to a colonial administrative name happened gradually. When the province of Manitoba was officially created in 1870 as part of the Canadian Confederation process, the name was already so embedded in common usage that it required no debate. No one proposed calling it something else. The spirit that scratched at the rocks had already won. What is striking about this origin is how precisely geographical it is. This is not a name borrowed loosely from a spiritual concept and applied broadly. It describes a specific sound at a specific place, understood through a specific cultural framework. The Narrows of Lake Manitoba were known, named, and interpreted long before any European wrote them down. The Misconception 90s. Here is where the common version of this story tends to go slightly sideways. Many sources, including some respectable ones, will tell you that Manitoba simply means the Strait of the Great Spirit, or where the Great Spirit lives. That framing is not wrong exactly, but it flattens something important. The word Manitou does not mean Great Spirit in the way that phrase implies, as a single supreme deity. Manitou describes a category of sacred power that can apply to many entities and presences. And the specific construction in the lake's name is not just place of Manitou, it includes the action, the scratching, the hands on the rock. This distinction matters because the Great Spirit translation erases the sensory story entirely. It turns a vivid, acoustically grounded experience into a generic spiritual label. The Cree name was not saying, a powerful being lives here. It was saying, something is scratching here right now, you can hear it. That is a completely different relationship with a place. The Great Spirit shorthand became common partly through missionary influence in the 19th century, as Christian translators mapped indigenous spiritual vocabulary onto their own theological categories. Manitou became Great Spirit, the same way Yahweh becomes God in translation. Something survives, but the texture is lost. Modern echoes. 90s. The acoustic phenomenon that gave Manitoba its name is still there. The Narrows still produce that grinding, scraping sound when the wind is right. Local guides and Cree knowledge keepers in the region still reference it when talking about the lake's history. The sound did not stop when the province got a legislature. In modern Cree language revitalization efforts, the full phrase behind the name is being recovered and taught, not just as etymology, but as a way of re-anchoring indigenous geographic knowledge. When a Cree language class teaches students that Manitoba means the place where the spirit scratches, that is not just a history lesson. It is a reassertion that the original interpreters of this landscape named it correctly, on their own terms, for their own reasons. The name also appears in the context of ongoing discussions about place name reform across Canada. Manitoba is in a relatively unusual position compared to many colonial-era names. It already carries an indigenous name that was adopted wholesale. The province was not renamed after a British official or a European monarch. It kept the Cree description. That is not nothing, even if the depth of that description has often been obscured. Deeper connections. To Menters. The root Manitou appears in a remarkable number of North American place names, and tracing them reveals how widely this concept traveled across different cultures and colonial encounters. Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron carries the same root, meaning roughly place of the Manitou, or Spirit Island. Manitowoc in Wisconsin comes from a related Algonquian construction. The word spread because the concept spread, or rather because the concept was already present across Algonquian-speaking peoples who shared related spiritual frameworks before European contact. Linguistically, Manitou connects to a broader Algonquian root that scholars describe as referring to something with inherent, often invisible power. The structure of the word in various dialects suggests it originally described a quality more than an entity. Something that has Manitou. Something that is Manitou. The noun came later, as these things often do. What this means for Manitoba,